What if everything you thought was solid, unquestionable truth just wasn't? And not in a paranoid way, not in a lose your grip on reality kind of way, but in a way that cracks open possibilities that you never even considered. Because here's the thing, most of us don't choose our beliefs. We inherit them from school, from the media, from people we trust who probably also inherited them. But what happens when we stop blindly accepting and start questioning? I had this moment a few years ago when I realized how many of my core beliefs about the world, about my own potential, about what was possible, weren't even mine. They were just things I absorbed. And once I started really looking, I saw just how much of my reality had been shaped by things I never even chose to believe. And that's a scary thought, right? Because if you tug on that thread, where does it stop? If one thing is off, how much else is? Right now, we're living in a time where information is everywhere, but truth is a little harder to find. Science is constantly evolving, institutions are being questioned, and people are waking up to the idea that maybe the official version of reality isn't the whole picture. So let me ask you, when's the last time you questioned something you always assumed was true? And on the other hand, when's the last time you considered an idea that felt too out there, but you entertained it anyways, just to see where it led? Because today, we're diving into exactly that. What happens when you stop taking the world at face value and start exploring deeper layers of reality? Today, our guest is Mark Gober. He's a former investment banker turned researcher and author whose work explores the nature of consciousness, reality, and the hidden structures shaping our world. His books and podcasts challenge conventional thinking, pushing the boundaries of what we consider fact. So in this episode, you'll learn why mainstream science might not be telling the whole story about reality and consciousness. How questioning what we've been taught can shift the way you see your life and your own potential. And the subtle ways information is controlled, and how to think for yourself in a world full of noise. And just a side note, if you're the type of person that gets really threatened by ideas you don't share or worldviews you don't think are possible, this episode is not for you. Find one of the other almost 500 episodes. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. You guys, workplace stress is killing us. 61% of people are dealing with stress levels that are way beyond normal. So if you're feeling it, you are not alone. I used to think I could just push through everything, work harder, sleep less, pretend I had it all figured out. But that approach nearly broke me. I am all about following your joy. If that voice in your head is telling you to make a change, listen to it. Maybe you are ready to quit your job. Maybe you do need to flip your whole life upside down. But either way, you need support and tools to navigate it well. And that's where therapy comes in. Modern therapy teaches you how to set boundaries without feeling guilty, how to manage anxiety before it spirals, how to make big moves from a place of strength instead of desperation. And BetterHelp has over 30,000 therapists and has helped 5 million people worldwide. And you can talk to someone from your couch. No waiting rooms, no awkward scheduling. Therapy gives you the clarity on whether that voice telling you to make a change is your intuition or just the Sunday scaries. But either way, you deserve support. As the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise. Unwind from work with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/mindlove. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/mindlove. Let me ask you something. How much time did you spend last week thinking about what to eat? Planning meals, making grocery lists, wandering around the store like a lost tourist. I used to waste entire Sunday afternoons on this, and it was exhausting. Then I found Hungry Root. Hungry Root fills your cart with personalized picks and plans your week of meals, getting smarter with every order. They have over 15,000 recipes to choose from each week, and most are ready in 15 minutes or less. I'm actually headed to Michigan this week, and I had my Hungry Root order delivered there. So I already know that I have meals ready and plenty of snacks for the kids without scrambling to find a grocery store. It's just handled. And what I love most is their smart cart technology. It learns what I actually like and then recommends groceries, recipes, and supplements just for me. So no more buying spinach that rots in my fridge. They screen out over 200 additives and only source high quality ingredients. The time I've gotten back has just been life-changing. So take advantage of this exclusive offer. For a limited time, get 40% off your first box, plus get a free item in every box for life. Go to hungryroot.com/mindlove and use code MINDLOVE. That's hungryroot.com/mindlove, code MINDLOVE, to get 40% off your first box and a free item of your choice for life. hungryroot.com/mindlove, code MINDLOVE.
The general direction of what we're speaking about here, there's just so much evidence, such an abundance. But if you're not familiar with that evidence, like me 10 years ago, for example, I would have just said, this is too much. What do you mean? How could this be true? Because I thought I was well educated. And that's why, at least for me, it's been a gradual process. If someone has a near-death experience and experiences the other realms and encounters beings and comes back, what happens to them is that they have a hard time adjusting because it's so much so fast that they often leave their jobs or get divorced. But the process that I've had has been much more gradual. And I could understand if you're just communicating with someone based on evidence, it takes time for the implications to really sink in. And therefore, just a one-time discussion isn't always going to do it in terms of getting someone to understand it. And that's what I find with my work. And I've talked to many other people as well. Let's say they read my book and they're like, whoa, what did I just read? I need to adjust to this, rather than my whole life changed immediately.
Turn up your frequency with Mind Love. Bite-sized brain hacks for seekers, dreamers, and doers. It's time to give your mind a little love with your host, Melissa Monti.
So what inspired you to question mainstream science's view of consciousness and and just making that such a big part of your life story?
It wasn't something that I was consciously seeking out at the time. My background is in business. So after graduating from Princeton, I moved to New York and worked in investment banking with a large bank called UBS. And this was during the financial crisis of 2008. Then I moved initially to Boston, but the majority of my time was in Silicon Valley at a company that advised technology firms, especially those that had intellectual property and innovative technologies. So I was in that business world. That's why I give the preface, because we're going to talk about things today that have nothing to do with that on the surface. But while I was working in Silicon Valley, I, number one, kind of hit a wall in my life where I felt like I was in a zombie state, just trying to achieve the next thing in front of me, because I had grown up like that, where I was always going after the next thing. I was a competitive athlete also growing up. I was one of the captains of the tennis team in college. So I had that mentality of always having a challenge and then trying to overcome it. And after a while of doing that for so long, I felt like I was on a treadmill, like I wasn't actually progressing. And with that mentality, it made it harder to handle the ups and downs. So things in the business world that weren't going my way, for example, or my personal life, it became harder and harder to just deal with the ups and downs of life. And part of it was that I didn't have any sense of meaning or purpose in life. So if you'd asked me then, Mark, do you think that anything happens when we die, or do you think we live in a random universe? I would have said to you very clearly that we live in a random and fundamentally meaningless universe. All we have is this life and this body, and when our brain shuts off, that's the end of it. And I would have said, that's just what science is teaching us. And if you believe in spiritual or religious things, you're free to do that, but it's really just all superstition. And science has transcended that. So that's where I was very firmly in 2016. So an atheist agnostic, and in this place of feeling like I was on a treadmill. And I started listening to podcasts that year because podcasts were becoming a little more popular, and some friends started sending me different podcasts. And I thought it was just an interesting thing to do when I was not in the office, to hear people from all walks of life speak. And I started listening to, initially it was Tim Ferriss, because he had all kinds of people on, like in the business world, but also some alternative health. And I heard him speak about psychedelics a lot, but he also interviewed some people that were talking about ways of improving life without taking a substance. So like going into a sensory deprivation tank, float tank with salt water where your body floats. So I said, okay, that's cool. I'm going to try that. So there was a part of me that was obviously a little bit curious, and I kept listening to podcasts and finding new shows. And ultimately I came across one called Extreme Health Radio. And one day they interviewed a woman named Laura Powers, who started talking about how she uses her psychic abilities with her clients. And the other episodes on that show were basically like alternative ways of treating disease. It wasn't that kind of a show where it was all about the paranormal, let's say. So I was just intrigued because this host of the show were taking her pretty seriously. And what I sensed in listening to her talk was that she was not lying. So I just wasn't sure if she was delusional or maybe there was some reality to what she was saying, which then led me to listen to her podcast called Healing Powers. And it was person after person that she interviewed that had this very similar worldview to what she described. And at a certain point, I said, okay, there's something going on here because I don't think these people are colluding. I don't know if they're all delusional in the same way. And then a lot of the references I heard on that show led me to various books and scientific papers, which essentially lead me to where I am now. But I became so obsessed with the topic because I realized if there was any reality to what I was hearing, then maybe there was actual meaning to life, like some kind of meaning built into the fabric of reality itself. Maybe there's more than meets the eye in terms of our own identity. Maybe there are other dimensions. Maybe we continue after our body dies. All this stuff that I never believed in previously, and also didn't know any other people who believed these things because people in my network were not of this mindset. So I felt very isolated at first because I didn't know how to communicate these things. But then eventually I started to express what I was learning to friends and family members, and they were actually pretty interested because I was doing it from a scientific perspective. And the more I did that, the more I realized that I was interested in it while I was still working. And I decided, okay, this was a year later, the summer of 2017. I said, why don't I just put this in writing and summarize my findings? So that was my book, An End to Upside Down Thinking. It was published in 2018. I did a podcast series the next year where I interviewed many of the scientists that I wrote about. It's called Where Is My Mind? It's eight episode bingeable series. And then I decided to leave my job right before everything happened in 2020. And long story short, I've now written 7 books total. But it all comes down to this initial exploration in 2016. What's the nature of reality? What's the nature of consciousness? And the answers to those questions bleed into other areas like cosmology and medicine and politics, because in my view, the first principle is we need to have a view on the nature of reality, who and what and where we are and why we're here. And that will inform all the other disciplines.
I love this rabbit hole. I've gone down multiple little paths of it. And what I find interesting is we're taught this sort of uniform worldview of what life is, what science is, what exists out there. But what I find wildly striking is if you actually go through the documents of CIA experiments, it paints a very different picture of what they know to be true than what they teach us. Do you think that that is on purpose?
When I first started researching, my view was that basically the concealment of this information, because you're describing a US government program that's been funded $25 million. There are declassified CIA documents that explicitly talk about the reality of psychic phenomena, which this stuff's all in my books. There's real scientific evidence here, peer-reviewed papers and whatnot. So the question then became for me, wait, what am I missing here? Because I thought I was pretty well educated, and I know a lot of people who are really smart and they've never heard these things. So I was trying to understand the mechanism. How could this be hidden? And where I started was, well, if we think about academia, you have professors who built their careers on a certain worldview. And if information came out showing that they're wrong, they would have to admit that they're wrong. So their own egos would probably try to prevent that. And this is what we see within academia. I've talked to many scientists who say that if you talk about these subjects as an aspiring professor, for example, or even as a professor who doesn't have tenure, you're potentially at risk of losing your job, or at least getting, at least your reputation could be harmed. And I even spoke with one woman who said she was told, she was at a major US university, told by her superiors that she should take her psychic research off her resume if she wanted to continue there. So there's a real pressure within the academic institutions, which I was initially attributing to this is just how paradigm shifts work. We get entrenched into one worldview, and it's hard to break out of that. So I still think that's an element of it. But now I'm wondering if there's something deeper, because this information is incredibly empowering to think that maybe our body is just a vessel for consciousness, and that our mind can actually impact reality, and that consciousness plays a more fundamental role in the universe than we're told. That means our own mindset is very important, which means we might have real significance. And it would make sense for someone, let's just say, who wanted to subjugate a population or keep people in a state of being disempowered to conceal this information and make people ignorant of it. So I'm reminded of an interview I heard on the Skeptico podcast with Mario Beauregard, who's a neuroscientist, one of the brave neuroscientists studying these sorts of phenomena like psychic abilities. He told me that he was told by the head of a neurological institute in Canada that as long as this person was alive, she would not allow him to study any spiritual phenomena scientifically. To which he responded on this podcast. He just said, I think this is social engineering and it's dark versus light, that there's an actual intent on some level to keep us in a state of ignorance that's beyond just mere ego.
I believe that too. And at first I didn't. I used to just think, wow, people need to know this. But you're right. Most people will do whatever it takes to protect their worldview. I tend to approach new ideas with curiosity. So when I hear something wild, my first instinct is, okay, let's pretend this is true for a minute. What would that mean? I collect ideas, I connect dots, see where they lead. But I've found most people just immediately shut down, like, no, impossible. And then they grip their version of reality so tightly that anything outside of it feels like a threat. And I get it. It's hard to shift paradigms, but the deeper you go, the more you start to see some people at the top do know. They've known. And when you look at how education and science and entire institutions are structured, it starts to feel less like a natural resistance to new ideas and more like maybe a deliberate effort to keep certain truths hidden. Because if people really understood their own power, if they really got how reality works, it might just disrupt the entire system.
What has really shifted me, Melissa, going from just the view that this is kind of naive ignorance just based on people's egos to the more nefarious version that we're talking about now, is that after writing my first book, I started to look at other disciplines like politics and economics and medicine and cosmology, so many different areas. And I was seeing the same pattern of what appeared to be the concealment of the truth and leading people down models that sounded like they were somewhat acceptable, but actually these are models that were either inefficient or couldn't accommodate certain phenomena, meaning they were leading people in the wrong direction. So after seeing this over and over again, and also after appreciating the fact that once we get into studying these metaphysical dimensions, whether it's through research on near-death experiences or psychedelics or people who have meditation experiences where they go to other realms, things like that, there does seem to be a dark versus light. I wrote about this a lot on my book on contact, referring to contact with non-human intelligences, whether they're related to UFOs or even just a multidimensional kind of intelligence that people will talk about on psychedelics, for example, or a near-death experience. The reports across the board, there are just so many of them that I think there's value to it, suggest that there's a spectrum, that some beings or energies are highly benevolent and loving, and there are others that are extremely nefarious, more nefarious than most of us would like to admit. Some of it gets extremely dark. But it actually makes sense when you think about what goes on here in our culture. We see that too. We see some people who are almost like saints in terms of the way they are altruistic. And then we see horrible things like human trafficking and a lot of things we hear about on the news that are just very disturbing. So it would make sense that if we existed in a multidimensional reality, that what we perceive here is some kind of a manifestation or a mirroring of what happens in other dimensions too.
I was just talking to a friend who's been trying to hire someone for 3 months. 3 months! She's been posting on random job boards, scrolling through resumes that make no sense, getting ghosted by candidates. It's a mess. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. Indeed's sponsored jobs help you stand out and hire fast. With sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the very top of the page for your relevant candidates so that you can reach the people that you want faster. And it makes a huge difference. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. One of the things I love about Indeed is that it just makes hiring so fast because you're not wasting time on platforms where nobody's actually looking. Your job gets in front of real candidates who are actively searching. Plus, with Indeed sponsored jobs, there's no monthly subscriptions, no long-term contracts, and you only pay for results. How fast is Indeed? Well, in the minute I've been talking to you, 23 hires were made on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. There's no need to wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/mindlove. Just go to Indeed.com/mindlove right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/mindlove. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. My worldview is I believe there are infinite dimensions. And I believe, so there's a dimension just slightly over, it reminds me of that movie Sliding Doors with Gwyneth Paltrow, one decision away. They're all existing. And this is what I mean when I say shifting timelines, because sometimes there can be a moment, a choice point, and I'm like, I feel everything pulling me this way, like my natural tendencies, my habits, my lower self. But there's a spark. What if I do this instead? What if I do something different instead? And it can shift me onto a higher timeline. That's how I believe that the world works. That's how I explain the Mandela effects. And so it's curious to consider life that way, because it's like there's a version of different versions of everybody, and you can kind of tune into them based on the frequency that you're holding right now.
I very much agree with you. And so what you're describing in this tuning in process is a subtle one. It's not something we can necessarily draw out or point to because it's happening within our own consciousness. So it's like a trial and error process as I've experienced it, in terms of identifying the negative thoughts or emotions that come up, or the ones that will cause suffering unnecessarily, and learning how to handle them so that they don't go out of control, and also how to basically reprogram belief systems. Because many of our beliefs are at a subconscious level. We don't even realize we have them. Who knows where they come from? It could have happened from some nondescript event in childhood that leads us to believe certain things about the way the world works, or about relationships, or about money, you name it. We have belief systems that are embedded within our system. So maybe tapping into the dark or light forces, so to speak, is related to the way in which we control our consciousness.
This is exactly why I'm so careful about what I allow into my consciousness now. I don't watch a lot of TV, and when I do, I stick to things that feel harmless, like a dating reality show. And I know it's not exactly elevating me, but at least I know it's not subtly programming me with ideas I never agreed to. And I think this is so important to me because I grew up the opposite. We lived with my grandma until I was 5, and for whatever reason, she was really into gory horror movies. The first movie I remember even watching was Child's Play, and I was terrified of dolls and the dark for years. Actually, even now, if I let the wrong thought in when I'm alone, I feel the impact of those early imprints. So now I'm just hyper aware. If there is a collective effort to keep us disempowered, then we have to ask ourselves, who controls Netflix? Who decides what narratives get pushed? And what seems like a harmless documentary or movie, what beliefs is it actually embedding in us? We know advertising works like this. A Pepsi can in the background isn't random. It's placed there because they know how it impacts the subconscious. So if they understand that level of influence, what else is being planted into our minds? And this might sound crazy, but there's actual CIA documentation on subliminal messaging. So it's not a conspiracy theory. It's just media psychology. And yeah, maybe this is too deep for some people, but to me, it's worth considering. We should be highly conscious of our inputs, who we spend time with, what we read, what we watch, the thoughts we allow to settle in. So why would we ever just sit back and absorb 2.5 hours of intense symbolism and subconscious programming without even questioning what's being fed to us?
I would recommend for your audience to look up MK Ultra. This is a declassified CIA program on mind control using very sophisticated technologies. And this is from many decades ago, so who knows how sophisticated it is now in terms of subliminal messaging and using frequencies to alter human behavior or perception. This is very sophisticated stuff. So often we might not even know it's happening, to your point. Then there's another part of me, because I've had to grapple with this myself in researching all of these topics, but especially the ones that are darker, where I want to know they exist, Because if I don't know they exist, then I might be more susceptible to them. But if I go too deep or get sucked into it, then they could almost capture my consciousness. And I felt that at times where it was so dark learning about some of the abuse to children. I don't even want to talk about it. And in my books, I only talked about it lightly. And even in that, I've heard people come back to me and say, Mark, like I had to kind of skip that part of the book. But I think it's important to acknowledge that that level of evil exists because then we can be appropriately cautious and not naive. So it's like you go in enough to understand it, but not get sucked into it. And that's the balance.
What do you say to people who automatically dismiss what you have to say because, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. He's one of them. We can't go there.
I would say let's talk about the evidence. And I haven't really heard good counters to many of these topics, maybe on the details. But the general direction of what we're speaking about here, there's just so much evidence, such an abundance. But if you're not familiar with that evidence, like me 10 years ago, for example, I would have just said, this is too much. What do you mean? How could this be true? Because I thought I was well educated. And that's why, at least for me, it's been a gradual process. If someone has a near-death experience and experiences the other realms and encounters beings and comes back, what happens to them is that they have a hard time adjusting because it's so much so fast that they often leave their jobs or get divorced. But the process that I've had has been much more gradual. And I could understand if you're just communicating with someone based on evidence, it takes time for the implications to really sink in. And therefore, just a one-time discussion isn't always going to do it in terms of getting someone to understand it. And that's what I find with my work. And I've talked to many other people as well. Let's say they read my book and they're like, whoa, what did I just read? I need to adjust to this, rather than my whole life changed immediately. It's like, okay, there's this evidence here. And when you actually look at the evidence and you're open-minded and looking for the truth, which not everyone is, sometimes they're just, people are interested in protecting their belief systems and don't care about the truth. But for someone who really cares and you see the body of evidence for this stuff, if one is intellectually honest, it's too hard to shoot down every single example. And if just one of these things is real, that's my approach. One little anomaly, a single black swan violating the law that all swans are white, for example. Like if someone says to you, Melissa, there's a law, all swans are white, and we go around the world and we find 2 million white swans, and one day you find a single black swan. Unfortunately, the law says all swans are white and all has a very specific meaning. Therefore, the model has been falsified and we need a new model to accommodate the anomalies. Often what people will do is say, well, Mark, you're just talking about a few anomalies on the edges here. If one of them is real, we got a real problem for our paradigms. And what I would argue is that many of them are real.
I've found that too. And now when I meet someone who's clearly looked at these things, there's this unspoken recognition like, oh, you see it too. It reminds me of being in another country where no one speaks your language. And then suddenly you hear someone speaking English and there's this instant connection because you both understand something that most people around you don't. But what's really interesting is I rarely see someone explore these ideas with an open mind and then just walk away unchanged. Because once you start questioning, once you follow the threads, things that never quite made sense before suddenly start to click and you see patterns and you see how information has been shaped or controlled or sometimes even buried. And at that point, it's hard not to wonder, why is there such a force keeping people from looking deeper? Why are certain conversations shut down before they even start? And I'm not here to tell people what to believe, but I do think curiosity is a superpower because once you allow yourself to look, you might start to see more than you ever expected.
That's right. You can't unsee it. You can't unhear it if you do have an open mind. There are some people, like you said, who just have a wall. It doesn't matter what you present them with. But for even a semi-open-minded person, it's just too much. And it's almost like the door is cracked open a little bit. And it might take a person a long time to fully open that door because they might be resistant to it. I found that with a lot of people I know, where maybe they heard about what I was writing about back in 2017 before it was published. And it's like, oh, Mark, I don't know. But now there's more and more evidence building and like the door is starting to open more and more where there's greater receptivity in the population. And so even though you can't unhear, unsee, the rate at which you progress is dependent upon one's willingness.
You talk about how consciousness is non-local and fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
Explain what that means.
The conventional belief of consciousness, and when I say consciousness, I'm referring to our subjective inner awareness, the part of us that experiences. It's a very difficult thing to define because we can't point to consciousness. Like we experience, but we can't draw it out So it's this abstract thing that we all have, and it's obviously very important because if we didn't have consciousness, we wouldn't even be able to have this conversation or absorb it or think about all these topics. And I had always thought that consciousness is something that pops out of our skull because of chemical and electrical activity inside the brain, and there's a whole field of neuroscience. So I figured, yeah, consciousness comes from the brain, and that's certainly the mainstream view in academia. The potential error that they're making, however, is they're assuming that the correlations we see between brain activity and conscious experience, which are well established, that indicates the brain creates consciousness. So think about it another way. What if the brain is like an antenna that's receiving consciousness or filtering it like an interface? You could also explain correlations between brain activity and conscious experience. It's just a different way of looking at it. So for example, imagine you're watching television and there's an antenna that's receiving the signal to watch, so you can watch your TV show, and you take a hammer and you smash that antenna. All of a sudden, the television show appears scratchy on your screen. That's not because the signal was damaged. The signal is untouched. The only thing that happened is that the apparatus responsible for processing that signal, the interface between the signal and your television set, that's been damaged. Whoa, what if our brain or our body are somewhat similar to that? Then our consciousness, to your question, is not something that's localized just to the brain. Maybe it's beyond the brain and beyond the body, and we're somehow tapping into it. And even more broadly speaking, what if consciousness is the fundamental basis of all reality, and everything that we call material is actually just a manifestation of consciousness? Max Planck, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist in 1931, he said, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness." So this is why my book's called An End to Upside Down Thinking. It says that maybe we have to rethink where consciousness is. And maybe it's more complex than just saying consciousness is fundamental, because reality probably is way more than we can understand. But it's at least a framework to take us away from the view that it's all just material. Consciousness pops out of our skull. It took 13.8 billion years of evolution to get to that point. And when you die, that's the end of your consciousness. Whoa, what if it's the other way around? We are vehicles or vessels of consciousness. Then all of a sudden, non-local phenomena are possible, meaning our consciousness could go out somewhere in space and time, and it could continue when the body dies. So these US government programs, like on remote viewing, which is psychic spying, that is the ability to perceive something in the mind that's away from the person, far away, in space and or time. And this is what declassified documents validate, among many other pieces of evidence. So that all of a sudden would become possible if consciousness is sort of the basis of reality. You're just tapping into a different part. It's almost like what Dr. Bernardo Kastrup says is that all of reality is a stream of water, like an infinite stream, and the water is analogous to consciousness. So by that analogy, each whirlpool within a stream is like a localization of consciousness. And if some of the water from one person's whirlpool gets into another whirlpool, that's like a non-local effect, a psychic ability, for example. Or if one person's whirlpool delocalizes, the water flows back into the broader stream. So the water didn't disappear from the stream. It just transitioned into a new form and maybe reconfigures into a new whirlpool at some point. That, by analogy, would be like if the human body dies, maybe the consciousness doesn't die. It transitions into a new form, and maybe it could reincarnate into something else. So when we have this new paradigm of consciousness, where it's the basis of reality, all of a sudden, what we might have called paranormal before is not actually paranormal. The word paranormal assumes what normal is, and maybe we got normal wrong.
I hate the word normal. The worst thing I could ever be called is normal. I created this membership community called the Mind Love Collective, and every month we explore a different theme. Well, my two favorite months are the expansion months and also mindset alchemy, which is the practice of transforming the way you think and really understanding the ripple effect that we have through our own personal growth. Because a lot of people see personal growth as this isolated thing, almost like a selfish act. And they think, oh, I shouldn't be focusing so much on myself. But when you really understand how this works, you see that your growth doesn't just change you, it changes everything around you. What fascinates me most is what neuroscience has shown about this ripple effect. So when you elevate your consciousness, you don't just shift your own energy, you actually impact every person you've ever come in contact with. That blows my mind. Studies even suggest that even people from your past, friends from high school, an old coworker, someone you haven't spoken to in years. They're all affected by your evolution today. And when you really sit with that, when you start to see that everything we do sends out waves, every shift, every realization, every moment of healing affects not just the people closest to us, but the collective as a whole. And when you see your growth that way, it definitely stops feeling like an indulgence and it becomes the most important thing that you can do.
I feel the same way. And that would make sense if consciousness is somehow fundamental, because if your consciousness is part of the whole stream, then you affect the whole stream by analogy when your consciousness shifts. It's almost like all boats are lifted when the sea level rises. So I agree. And I think by elevating our own consciousness, even if we don't affect someone, if we don't see someone, we could affect them. But when you do see someone, also, you have maybe a better mechanism of contributing because you're more whole yourself. So you've refined yourself and therefore you're more able to serve. And that's one of the paradoxes that I found, because it's natural to want to serve others when one embarks on this path, because you realize the interconnectivity and that there's real meaning and purpose in life. And for example, in the near-death experiences, people have a life review very often where when they're in a state when they're, let's say, in cardiac arrest or they're clinically dead or close to it, their consciousness relives their whole life. And they become each person that they affected. So they feel what it was like to be the person that they treated well or not. And so when they come back, they often say how you treat people is so critical. That's a big part of the fabric of reality. And this is such a consistent message. So there's this emphasis then on being of service, which is really good, but we're of service to our best ability when we are really whole internally and have worked through our own stuff.
Some of the strongest evidence for consciousness beyond the brain comes from phenomena like terminal lucidity or children remembering past lives. What cases have stood out to you the most?
Terminal lucidity is a good one. And I like it because it's acknowledged in the mainstream. This is where, and often reported by hospice workers, by the way, someone, let's say, has had Alzheimer's disease for years. So the person's memory is not normal. And we can see in their brain that there's a big effect on their brain. It's not a normal brain. And their consciousness is affected. But often shortly before they die, they will snap back into clarity as if nothing happened. So it's a very strange phenomenon of a damaged brain, but a normal consciousness. And likewise, savant syndrome is acknowledged by the mainstream, and the telepathy tapes, the new very popular podcast, is talking about basically autistic savants, but you don't have to be autistic necessarily to be a savant. It's someone who has extraordinary abilities in terms of memory, musical abilities, mathematical abilities. The movie Rain Man is a good example. Dustin Hoffman played a character who was a savant. The question is, how could this happen? Because a savant typically has severe damage in the brain or severe abnormalities, and yet their consciousness is enhanced in certain ways. That is not well explained by mainstream science, even though they acknowledge that it occurs. So in my podcast series, Where is My Mind? My producers and I included clips from Daryl Treffert, who's a mainstream scientist who studied savants. And he said things like, I can't explain it. Some of these people, we see it over and over again, they're telepathic. And it doesn't fit my worldview, but it's almost like they're tapping into universal consciousness. He was forced to even utter those words, even if he didn't quite believe it. That was pretty powerful. But you mentioned children with past life memories. This is another one that for me that I just had a hard time getting around when I first started researching, where at the University of Virginia, their division of perceptual studies at the medical school, it's a pretty credible place. Starting in the 1960s, Dr. Ian Stevenson, a child psychiatrist, was studying allegations of young children, let's say 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 years old, who started speaking about a life that was not theirs with vivid detail. And this was not like the kids were all saying they were Cleopatra or some famous person. Often it was an obscure person. And in the best cases, the researchers could find historical records that aligned with what the children said. Very difficult to explain with normal means. In some cases, the children had birthmarks or physical deformities aligning with the way they claimed to have died in the previous life. And in the best cases, the researchers had medical records they could find which confirmed that there was a person who died in that exact manner, the way the child described it, and corresponds with the birthmarks or physical defects. So for example, if the if the person had died in the previous life, allegedly of gunshot wounds, sometimes the child would have birthmarks in the area in the entry and or exit wound areas. There's another case that I mentioned in my book, An End to Upside Down Thinking. I show an image from Dr. Ian Stevenson from UVA's book. It's called Where Reincarnation and Biology Intersect, where there's a photo of a young girl who has these very strange indentations in her legs, as if they had been tied with ropes, except there was no rope there. This little girl talked about being tortured in a previous life, and she said, "Grandpa, look at what they did to me, how cruel they were," pointing to these deformities in her leg. And there was, in fact, a person who died in that manner. It was near their town. And that was just somewhat of a different case because the mother had seen the murder while she was pregnant, if I'm remembering it correctly. And this is known as a maternal impression. So I don't know how that fits in, but there are other instances where the mother had no correspondence to the person that allegedly died in the previous life. And there are even some portion of these cases. Dr. Jim Tucker from UVA co-wrote an article on this where a percentage of children claiming to have remembered a previous life talk about an intermission period between lives when they chose their parents, among other things.
I have full body chills right now because there's so much coming up. So one of my favorite books to gift people, especially adults, even though it's a children's book, is The Little Soul. So it explains the way our life experience is just so simple and profound. It tells the story of a soul choosing to incarnate into the world. And I love how it frames the whole process. A lot of times when I have big questions about reality, I don't try to force an answer. I just set an intention, almost like a prayer during meditation. And I just ask, show me. And what's wild is how often the answers do show up. Sometimes it's instant, like a notification popping up on my phone about the exact thing I was thinking about, or my son's cartoon suddenly dropping a line that just hits way too deep to be a coincidence. So recently I was asking what it means to come into this world. And then out of nowhere, two different people shared stories about remembering their own birth and not just coming out of the womb, but coming into this realm. And one of them said it felt exactly like that scene in The Matrix where people are in pods and then break through into this reality. And then someone else shared that in their meditation, they got the message that stars are actually portals of where souls enter this realm. And I don't know if that's true, but I love playing with the idea. And so now when I look up at the stars, I don't just see these distant lights. I wonder, who's being birthed into the world right now?
I'm really open to that. I wrote about this in my book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos. I don't think we have a good understanding of the lights in the sky, what they are, even what they're made of, or how far away they are, or whether they are portals in some way. So I'm actually reminded also of the work of Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a famous mystic a few hundred years ago. He wrote a book called Other Planets, and he talked about being taken to basically another realm with his consciousness by these angelic forces, as if it's not even a physical place. Let's say that it's more interdimensional. So I think on this theme of like not being too bound to any mainstream paradigm, I think it's really important to be open to all of it, not just within our own consciousness, but the world that we see around us, because we often superimpose our beliefs about things on them and just assume that they're right. But what if we looked at everything with a fresh set of eyes and imagine we had no education about anything, where there were no scientists telling us that they did the math and they can prove certain things are true? Imagine you just observed. We might have very different opinions on what this world is.
Yeah, I see a potential agenda of creating a worldview for as many people as possible that everything is random, accidental, and you're insignificant. And when you hold that view, and from wherever that comes from, it vastly changes your relationship with a higher power of yourself, of your own importance.
Yeah, we don't really have independent validation. As Dr. Steve Young says, he's a theoretical physics PhD who wrote a book called A Fool's Wisdom, that the information we get about space exploration is, by definition, unfalsifiable and unverifiable, so rendering it unscientific relative to being able to do a normal controlled study. So I do have a lot of questions about that as well. But to your point about the notion that we're not special, That's sort of what you're alluding to, that we're just kind of randomly here. But that goes to cosmology as well, that we're just this little speck in the massive universe in a cold, almost infinite vacuum that's been expanding since the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. So unimaginably long ago in an unimaginably far away place that no one's ever verified, by the way. It's all based on inference of observations. But the idea that that started it all and led us to be in this massive universe, and well, we're not that special. Stephen Hawking, the famous physicist, he said, we believe this on principles of modesty. Modesty, that's not scientific, that's a philosophical preference. And so there has been this Copernican principle which basically posits that we do not occupy a special place in the cosmos. And that has biased many of the observations because we can observe things and come to different conclusions about why they happen. So for example, we can observe that the grass outside is wet and conclude, okay, well, it rained. It's true that rain would explain wet grass, but seeing wet grass doesn't necessarily mean that it rained. There are other models like dew or sprinkler system or many, many other possibilities. So it's the same thing. Yes, or we could sit here for a whole hour and come up with possibilities. So we can't. What happens in cosmology too, I think, is that we've gotten locked into a model because of this Copernican principle. Edwin Hubble, who was part of the expanding universe theory, which led to the idea of a Big Bang, he talked about it as an unwelcome proposition, a horror. This related to the notion that Earth could occupy a special place in the cosmos. So a lot of his observations were force fit into the model that we're not special. And the expanding universe is sort of like if you have dots on a balloon and blow up the balloon, they all expand similarly far away. But that was just one way to explain the observations, whereas maybe Earth does occupy a much more special place when you look at a bunch of other data that we're not taught about in school, even recontextualizing Galileo's observations, which could be explained in a different model, not just the Copernican model that Earth revolves around the sun. And I know this is very controversial stuff if your audience has never heard it before, but I'm telling you, I was very skeptical of it as well, but I started going through the logic and said, oh my goodness, I may not know for sure, but there are many other possibilities here.
I always tell people, if your first instinct when you hear an unfamiliar perspective is anger or the urge to insult someone, it's actually a sign that something deeper is at play. Because really, why do we care so much what someone else believes? What is it about that idea that triggers such a reaction? That's the exact question I started asking myself when I just began reassessing the sources that I trusted. Instead of just accepting or rejecting something outright, I turned inward and I started noticing. Are there certain things where my knee-jerk reaction is to dismiss or ridicule? And if so, why? Where did that reaction come from? What inputs have shaped the way that I see the world? And I'm not here to say one thing is true or another isn't, but I have found that it's much more interesting to just approach new ideas with curiosity. If someone presents a concept that contradicts every single thing I believed, I don't just push it away, I play with it. I ask, what if I held this as truth for a moment? How would that change my perspective? What would open up for me? And if that shift empowers me in some way, if it expands how I move through the world, then I don't really see a downside to it. One example of this that I just found so intriguing is how people started questioning space when they got access to super zoom cameras. Because before we only had images from textbooks and organizations like NASA. But now with personal technology just getting so much better, people can look at the sky themselves and notice things that don't quite match what they expected. And that doesn't mean that anything is absolutely being hidden, but it does show how much we've relied on secondhand sources for our understanding of the universe.
What I find is that people who get triggered on this topic often are not even familiar with the arguments that are put forth. They have a very rudimentary understanding of what is even being put forth. And often I'll hear the argument that, well, Mark, why would you challenge the basic cosmology if we can explain things so well? There's so much that we can explain. Now, going back to my point before, just because a model explains something doesn't mean that there are other models that could also, there might be other ones that can explain it too. But even the idea that we've got it so well figured out with the current cosmology is completely wrong. And let me explain why. Because on its face, physics tells us, mainstream physics, that 96% of the universe is dark matter and dark energy. 4% of the universe is stuff that we know. In other words, we had to plug in 96% of the universe to maintain mainstream physics. And one of the best examples to me is dark matter. And I start my book off this way and end to the upside down cosmos. Dark matter was quote unquote discovered in 1933 by an astronomer named Fritz Zwicky, who was observing a cluster of galaxies called the Coma cluster. And basically the way they were moving did not align with Einstein's view of gravity, which is fundamental to mainstream physics, meaning that there was missing mass on the order of over 99% or so was missing in order for Einstein's gravity to make sense. So there are two options as I see it. One, you could say we discovered that there's some kind of mass or matter, dark matter, that we don't understand, but it's there because obviously we can't mess with Einstein's gravity. Or maybe we have to rethink all of gravity and all of physics. And what's happened? They went with dark matter. The problem is that dark matter has now been falsified by more than 5 sigma statistical confidence. That means more than 99.99+% chance that it's been falsified. This is the work of astrophysicist and professor Pavel Krupa in Germany, and his colleagues have been looking at this for over 20 years. And they say, we're looking at the predictions that you'd expect based on dark matter, and they're not there. We're falsifying it. So that means on its face, physics has big problems. Even if you just accept that dark matter and dark energy exist, that's 96%. That's a big mystery. And if you put on top of that, dark matter at least has been falsified. Dark energy's got big problems too. So maybe we do need to start from scratch. And on top of that, in physics, there is no unifying theory that can reconcile Einstein's relativity, which is a massive theory in physics, and quantum mechanics. These are the two leading theories in physics. But when you put them together, metaphorically speaking, the equations blow up. What does that tell you? No, we don't have it figured out. So when someone tells me, well, I observed this and the heliocentric model where the sun's at the center and Earth's revolving around it as a sphere, that can explain it so well. It's sort of like saying, grant me these few miracles of the foundations of physics being right, even though they're not clearly not right, and then I can explain everything to you. So I think, and this is why I start my book off this way, we need to actually start from scratch. And I want to return to your point earlier about the negative reactions people have. There's a phenomenon known as the cosmic microwave background. It's really famous. Anyone can Google it. There's a Nobel Prize awarded for it. It's this background radiation that can be measured, and it's believed to come from the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. The problem is that there are these little anomalies that suggest that it's actually pointing toward Earth, which suggests that maybe Earth is somehow at the center. And this, the name they gave it, Melissa, in science, is the axis of evil in the cosmic microwave background. Why would you call a scientific finding evil? Because the implications contradict mainstream cosmology so much that maybe Earth occupies a special place and we'd have to rethink so much. That's just a little snippet. But when you really think about it, maybe we do need to rethink things.
How has this exploration changed, guided, created your spiritual views?
All of it has made me more and more spiritual because I think not just looking at consciousness, but looking at cosmology from a new lens, it makes me feel like there's real meaning and purpose to our lives and to whatever this place is. I don't know what it is, that there's something really significant and there's an intelligence behind it that we are somehow blocked from in certain ways, but also connected to. And that makes me ask questions about what our real history is. How do we get to this point? Is the evolutionary timeline that we've been told from Darwin and so forth requiring billions and billions of years? Is that all true if the cosmos maybe didn't start 13.8 billion years ago? And maybe that's all wrong? Do we have to rethink how we got to where we are today? And what kinds of intelligences might be at play here? So it's maybe much more open-minded, but ultimately I found it to be a liberating perspective. And I can't really put into words how that's happened. How does cosmology relate to liberation? There's maybe a part of me that knew on some level, and maybe all of us know that we are deceiving ourselves through all kinds of mental gymnastics and assumptions built into mathematical equations that are not correct. And we're violating or disregarding our basic observations. Because if you think about it, forget all science for a second. What do we observe? We observe the stars moving around us in the sky, the sunrise and sunset, as if the sun is rising and the sun is setting, not due to our motion, but due to the sun's. We observe that everything is moving around us. That's just objectively true. And Einstein and Stephen Hawking admitted that just based on the way that we view things in the sky, we can't tell whether Earth is at the center or the sun is. It's known as a kinematic equivalence. Just based on those observations, one or the other could be true. And like I said, the Copernican principle, that philosophy, has steered us toward the sun being at the center. But also, if you really think about it, and I'm going to preface this by saying it's super controversial, we never observe spherical curvature. A sphere is something, if you're at the top of the sphere, because the belief is that we're on a ball with a radius value of roughly 4,000 miles at the equator, very specific proposition that's being put forth. We never observe the down and away curvature in our everyday life. We observe circularity, where it's curved in a circular sense, but that's not down and away. If you think about it, if you're in an open field, it looks like you're in a dome almost. But that's circularity. That's not the same as a sphere where it's going down and away from you. The circularity can be explained through something called perspective. And the formal terminology is an azimuthal grid of vision, where basically we have a limit to how far we can see. We can't see forever. And also, if you look at objects that are far away, they look like they are moving down. So I'll put it, well, down relative to the observer. If you are, think about being on a street, okay, a straight road, and there are street lights, all the same height. It looks like the street lights in the distance are lower than the ones closer to you. Actually, they're approaching your eye level. So if you apply that line of thinking to everything you observe around you, including the lights in the sky, things that are far away, but actually might be right above you, or in terms of how high they are, look like they're down. If that makes sense. It's much easier to show this in a diagram, but if you apply that, it's known as perspective. You end up with this apparent circularity, but that's not actually there. So this is my long-winded way of saying that what we observe on a daily basis is not a sphere, and it's not us moving around other things. Now that, what I just said, doesn't prove anything, but it makes us perhaps question things. And there are many other observations that we could talk about that actually more directly challenge the spinning globe.
Definitely interesting to consider. And look, if you're listening to this and you're feeling resistance, I totally get it. But I also invite you to ask yourself, why does this idea trigger something in you? Because for me, I don't necessarily feel the need to be on board with any one perspective. Half the time I'm just exploring and letting ideas unfold and then seeing where they lead. I think life is a lot more fun when we just give ourselves permission to question, to play with different perspectives, to stay open to what we don't really understand yet. But I'm curious about you. How has all of this exploration, or has it, changed anything about how you approach your daily life?
It's helped me to reprioritize life. And this started initially in 2016, almost 10 years ago now, when I started researching, where my life was reprioritized and recontextualized, ultimately leading me to leave my job where I had become a partner at my firm and spent my whole career to get there. And I realized, wow, I actually don't value what I'm doing on a daily basis as much. And I have to pursue this other path, not knowing that it would lead to more writing. So the things that I value have changed, but also, especially as I've gotten into more and more controversial territory. I mean, just we're scratching the surface of this cosmology topic. There's so much more to it that is absolutely mind-blowing. And because I've written the book on it and have had to look at so many resources, it becomes very much embedded in my blueprint almost, at least to question things without really knowing what's true. To me, it's more about questioning. It's led me to feel more, I've been forced to feel more comfortable putting out controversial ideas and being authentic versus trying to protect myself so that I can protect a reputation or something. And I knew there are always people who get upset with me and say, Mark, I really liked you up until this book. I mean, imagine I've written 2 books on politics. That's automatically going to polarize at least half the world. And that I have had to deal with the internal struggle of that. And then wanting to write about cosmology, and some of the things I read about with regard to medicine really challenged the allopathic model and the germ theory paradigm, so much more. So internally, I've gotten more comfortable with and feeling the requirement to go forward when I feel like I can credibly put forward questions. And I feel like that's more important than any reputational problems, because I can feel whole within myself. So needing to be authentic is more a requirement. In other words, I'm less tolerant of inauthenticity, and I feel it in my body, and will even get sick sometimes when I'm not being authentic. My body will tell me. Whereas previously, I used to just fight through it because I was used to fighting through it. If you're in pain in tennis, just keep going. You got to win. Or investment banking, you got to get your financial model done. It's 2 a.m. Stay up the extra 4 hours to get it done. Just push through. Now I'm more sensitive to, wait, I'm being told something by my body that I'm not being authentic. Maybe it's not appropriate to push through here. Maybe I need to go with what's authentic, even if some people don't like it.
It's interesting to me how even in mainstream narratives, we all accept that some pretty magnificent things have happened that we can't fully explain. But instead of really brainstorming all of the ways that they could have been possible, we tend to just latch on to whatever's most familiar. So take the pyramids, for example. People generally accept that they were built with some kind of, primitive system. And we see these cartoon depictions of these scrawny little workers hauling these massive stones with rope and planks. But then there's another camp that says, no, that's impossible. Aliens must have helped. And that's a conversation that people seem comfortable having. But if you question other aspects of history, especially the ones that we've been told are decided upon, people get so defensive. One of my absolute favorite explorations is the idea of lost history. There's a whole school of thought that suggests that the Dark Ages were fabricated for the most part, and that instead of this period of regression, there were really advanced civilizations like Tartaria and Atlantis and others. And I don't claim to know the truth, but it is such a fun rabbit hole to go down. And I think there's a lot of value in just challenging what we've been taught, not even necessarily to disprove anything, but just to open our minds to other possibilities. And I've found that the more I just sort of casually bring these ideas up, the more I find people who have also gone down these same rabbit holes. And when you find someone else who's also digging into these topics, it's like realizing that you're both speaking the same secret language, and it just makes for the best conversations.
Yeah, I've definitely found that as well, that being open-minded is critical in this path, and understanding that we don't know all the answers, because many things that we're told are true. We have to ask, how do we know those things are true that we've been told? And when you really think about it, many of the assumptions we're told are based on shaky foundations, and we just accept them as being true because someone told us or a history book told us. But how do we actually know what's true and what's not? And I am very much open-minded for all those reasons. Like, can we really verify what happened a long time ago? Can we trust all the history books? I mean, we know that history is written by the victors, and we just see it even in the mainstream media today, that a narrative is put forth but with bias, and then that goes in the history books as if it's true. But imagine multiplying it by all these years and no social media to verify anything. How can we really know what's going on? And when you were talking about recontextualizing history and the potential of advanced life here, I've been intrigued by Mike Wilkerson's work. He has a YouTube channel called Stellium 7. He's a chiropractor, but started to investigate a mountain near where he lives in Spain that's known for looking like an elephant. Have you heard about this?
Oh, I don't know. I wasn't sure where you were going with that. I thought you might have been talking about how some formations that we call mountains actually look exactly like giant tree stumps. And when you really look at their composition, it's strange. Like, why would lava naturally form into an octagonal shape? That's another fun one to explore.
No, exactly. But that's part of the same thing, that he talks about titans, whether they're plants or animals. But this mountain that he explored that looks like an elephant, he started to go through the different caverns himself when he hiked and compared it to the anatomy of a normal elephant, for example, and is finding that these orifices correspond very closely to what you'd expect in a smaller elephant, just on a bigger scale. And he's seeing this across with many other formations in geology, that it might literally be some kind of a petrified biology from some other time. He also looks at a lot of rocks that might be petrified hearts, and he compares the anatomy of a normal heart, like the aorta. He can go through all this stuff, and it's like, whoa, actually, what we just call rock formations might be some older form of biology that has been petrified. And when blood is dried a certain way, it looks like this kind of rock. It's a type of exploration most people wouldn't think to do. For one reason is that if Earth is a sphere with the radius value we're told, it wouldn't make any sense to have beings that large, because they would only take a few steps, relatively speaking, and they would be back in the same place. But if we live in a different kind of environment, then maybe you could have massive titans. And ancient mythologies, even the Bible talks about the Nephilim, that there were massive creatures. David versus Goliath. We think about all that stuff as mythology, but maybe there's some reality to in ancient history where there were other forms of life that were much larger than we're told.
Some people actually believe that what we call dinosaur bones might actually be remnants of giant animals that don't really fit the mainstream narrative. I saw someone break down a comparison once where they lined up a dinosaur skeleton next to, I think it was an enlarged rabbit skeleton, and it looked almost exactly the same. And I don't know, this isn't my area of expertise, but what I find even more interesting is how ancient civilizations left behind cave drawings of dragons, but not dinosaurs. And we're told these are just myths, but what if they weren't? What if they were drawing what they actually saw? It wouldn't be the first time history was rewritten to keep us from asking the right questions.
Yeah, and why are we so quick to discount what ancient civilization said, or just ancient culture as, oh, they didn't really know what was going on. If they had modern science, they would know. When in fact, maybe they were much more advanced, and we're the ones who are behind. And because of our closed-mindedness and our narrow science, we regard their stuff as mythology. Dr. Dean Radin from the Institute of Noetic Sciences, where I serve on the board, actually, he wrote a book called Supernormal, and he looks at these abilities from, let's say, the Hindu tradition, for example. They're called siddhis, the ability to levitate, or like those things that sound totally like science fiction, amazing psychic abilities. He calls the book Supernormal because maybe it's not supernatural. We just don't understand what normal is. And these are people who are just tapping into heightened abilities that we could all tap into if we got to an elevated enough state. So it's like our limited understanding of the universe allows us to call those people stupid, basically, and ignorant of the past, when maybe we're the ignorant ones. And doesn't that really apply all over the place these days?
Right. And how often does it feel like modern science is just catching up to what ancient civilizations already knew? Maybe they had a deeper connection to their intuition, or maybe it's because they weren't boxed in by these rigid, pre-approved versions of reality before the programming, before the institutions dictated what was acceptable to believe. They were just observing, experiencing, knowing, which makes you wonder how much wisdom has been lost or buried or even erased deliberately.
Exactly. The programming starts so young that it's probably hard for us to conceive what it would be like without that education. And now I used to think I was well educated. Now I think I was well programmed. And it's an unlearning process for me to really go back to every assumption I was told. And especially when it comes to anything with regard to history and time, verifying that I'm very skeptical of, but also things that are beyond normal observation, like things at the massive cosmic scale or at the microscopic scale, where you need someone in a white lab coat who knows how to just work with the lab equipment and do things in a computer, like some kind of black magic that we don't really understand the math they're doing, for example. When we have to rely on those things where some expert's going to tell us what's right without our direct ability to observe it, I'm much more skeptical now. And what I found in these domains, whether it's microbiology or cosmology, they're making a lot of inferences that might not be true. And I'm thinking more and more they're actually wrong about a lot of things.
I do find it curious. As a mother of toddlers, you just start to notice patterns, right? And ABCs and numbers, perfect sense as early lessons. But why is it that dinosaurs and space are the other big focuses? Like, why are these narratives drilled in so early? It's just interesting. Of all things a young child could be learning, why these? And I don't claim to have the answers, but these are the questions I ask. And honestly, I've stopped feeling the need to land anywhere definitive. I like to just stay open because I know how easily the brain attaches to ideas and how quickly we build our identities around beliefs. So it actually takes effort to resist the urge to commit to a fixed view of reality. So now I just observe. And even when there's an overwhelming evidence for something, I remind myself, things shift. New information emerges. Perspectives evolve. And the most life-changing shift I've made is just learning to trust my own inner wisdom just as much as external knowledge. Because when you really start valuing your own discernment or gut instincts, that alone can change everything.
I find myself in the mode of trying to falsify claims that are put forth without knowing exactly what's true to replace it, which is an okay position to be in because then it's just we don't know the answer. The problem is if a model says this must be true, like, for example, that Earth is an oblate spheroid with a radius value of roughly 4,000 miles at the equator, there should be certain things that are literally blocked from our view because they're on the other side of the ball, just like trying to see around a bend. And yet repeatedly, people are seeing things that should be blocked by the curve of Earth, and yet they're visible. And this is why there's so many people questioning cosmology, because they can go out and do the math of what a sphere should be. And basic geometry tells you one thing and you're observing something else. And the only way to explain it is, well, you must be looking at a mirage and the light's somehow bending. So you're looking at something and it looks like it's there, but it's not actually there. And if you look with an infrared camera, which is supposed to get rid of the light refraction, you still see it. That should never happen. I don't care what other observations are out there. There are these certain types of observations that falsify a model. That doesn't tell me I know for sure what's real, but that's just one example. And we can do the same thing with medicine and other areas. So I'm with you on that I'm in a place of not being committed to one thing. But when we're told how the universe allegedly started 13.8 billion years ago, so far away, or what happened hundreds of millions of years ago based on a few observations of things we see in the ground, based on our inferences of our technology that's going to tell us about what happened a long time ago and certain dating technologies, I have skepticism too, because they're coming up with one narrative, which their model would accommodate these observations. But again, there might be other models that are more precise that can also accommodate the things they're finding.
And we're told that order doesn't come from chaos, except for that one time in the most important event in the history of existence. And we're just supposed to accept that. I could talk about this stuff all day. My audience knows I love rabbit holes. Not sure if they realize I go this deep, but either way, it's been really fun bringing some of these ideas into the light. But before we wrap up, I love leaving listeners with something to chew on, something that they can just take into their own lives to just ground these ideas and play with them a little. So if you had to give one thought experiment or action step for people to explore this week, what would it be?
If you're told something is true, to ask the question, how do I know that's true? And if you have some time and interest, to look into the foundations of it. And this is really important today when people are super busy or they just look at a headline. And the headline also often will embellish or maybe say something as if it's true, but it's really an inference, and to look at the evidence for what is put forth and see, where did that evidence come from? Is it exactly true? Is there an agenda behind the information that's being told to us? Is it possible that someone is innocently propagating an agenda just because they believe it and they're not necessarily nefarious? But to really ask those questions, because what I found is that now that I investigate everything that I'm told is true, like every single thing, that often the assumptions underlying what I'm told are very shaky.
I've noticed that for a lot of people, their entire archive of knowledge is basically just headlines. I see it all the time, especially in my own family. Someone will say, oh, I just read that organic is a scam. And then I ask why. And they saw one article claiming that and never really looked deeper. Yeah, sure, some organic companies are shady, but that doesn't mean organic food as a whole is a scam or doesn't exist. And no judgment, because I catch myself doing it too. Sometimes I'll stop and think, wait, why do I believe this? Where did I get this idea? And I'll realize it was just a headline I saw 6 years ago and I never even read the article. But that's why I think it's so important, especially now, to question our sources. We all know the news can be manipulated. And so if we can't fully trust the media, what about history books? Who wrote them? What did they leave out? What narratives have or were shaped to serve a purpose? But that's why I love conversations like this. So thank you so much for just opening our minds a little more today, breaking down so many of these topics with real intelligence, research, nuance. And so for listeners who want to dive deeper into your work, where's the best place to connect with you?
My website is a good place to start. It's just my name, markgober.com, markgober.com. Also, all 7 of my books are on Amazon. They are in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats. I narrate all the Audibles myself. And I have an 8-episode podcast series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the major players. It's called Where Is My Mind? It goes into the science of children with past life memories and near-death experiences and the U.S. government's program. I interviewed one of the leaders of the program from the 70s. So you get to hear from the experts themselves. Where is my mind?
All right, let's take a breath, because that was a lot. And I love conversations like this, because whether you agree, disagree, or land somewhere in between, you're thinking. And that is the whole point. So if nothing else, I really hope today's episode sparks something in you. A curiosity, a willingness to question. Because when you do, you open doors to new perspectives, to deeper truths. And most importantly, to your own power to shape the reality you experience. And that's where story comes in, because the way you frame your past, the way you interpret the world, it all creates your future. Which is why I put together my Story Magic Guide to help you start seeing your own life through a new lens, one that empowers you instead of limiting you. So if today's episode got your wheels turning, this guide will take it further. You can grab it at mindlove.com/magic. And here's my challenge for you this week. Every time you come across an idea, a belief, or a fact, pause. Ask yourself, how do I know this is true? Did I see the evidence for myself? Or did I just absorb it from somewhere? Be intentional about what you accept as truth, because when you start questioning, you start seeing. And when you start seeing, you start creating the reality that you actually want. And if this conversation resonated with you, send it to a friend who loves going deep. Maybe not one of those friends who's too quick to call you crazy, though. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss more conversations like this. But keep your mind open, keep your questions sharp, and keep your story in your hands. You can find all my sponsors at mindlove.com/sponsors. And if you're intrigued by the Mind Love Collective, that I mentioned in this episode, where we talked about the Mindset Alchemy months and the Ripple Effect months, you can go to mindlove.com/join for more info. Thanks for giving your mind a little love today, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks for tuning into Your Higher Frequency with Mind Love. Head to mindlove.com for a free gift to keep your vibes up until next week.